list, more or less the things that we're going to measure in our data set, but you can, this literature is about many things that could have these consequences for the future.
Why this is just for journalists?
We're gonna, that's a good question. We're looking at,
This is very unfair.
we have information for older people, for kids, for people until 24, but we're looking only for teenagers because of the developmental psychology literature that worries that they're not taking a decision with the cognitive abilities to take a decision. So that's why we are entering a discussion on this.
You can test that they are more risky than the old.
We have data until age 24. We could,
Okay.
if the editor wants us to do that, we'll do it.
That's the honest answer.
So adolescence is a critical stage in life. Just like I said, cognitive abilities, social abilities, emotional development are going on. It's a phase where many things are going on. Perhaps we don't remember, many of us don't remember that, but it did actually happen to us too. And it's relevant for economics because what your paper just showed, we want them to have a good educational attainment, good educational results, and it depends on the other activities they're taking on, and also in terms of economics, because there might be externalities. It's not only internalities in the sense that we might be taking a decision that they might regret in the future. It's pretty much the idea of the developmental psychology just cited, but the idea that there are also externalities with crime, accidents, they could end up in dependence on the state or the cost of insurance and many other things going on that depends on people in general, not only young people taking these risky actions. When we think about this problem, we are thinking in terms of a trade-off between, in this case, present benefits against future costs. And when we look at this from the traditional economics point of view, we have to cite Becker and Murphy, the TORA, it's called TORA, the theory of rational addiction, where individuals maximize expected utility with consistent preferences, and the instantaneous utility function not only depends on your current consumption, but also on your past consumption. The stock of cigarettes you have smoked so far, and how many times you have been binge drinking on weekends. And so we want to feel that the marginal utility of the next cigarette depends on how many cigarettes you smoked on the past. That's pretty much what the TORA, the theory of rational addiction. There are other insights, just as I told you, there's the developmental psychology that has lots to do when it comes to teenagers. They worry about having the cognitive abilities to take a decision looking forward, of the emotional state where you're in the minute that you're having unprotected sex, or peer pressure, the social issues going on at the same time, which could be embedded into the TORA model, of course. There's also the behavioral economics literature, where perhaps kids are not looking enough into the future. They feel they are immortal. If I take drugs, bad things happen to other people, but they never happen to yourself. So there's the idea of vulnerability and myopia, and you're not taking account all the future consequences that might eventually come. And also there's the idea not only of myopia, but it could be time inconsistency. You think that in the future you're going to behave better, or you think that in the future you might feel bad, and you're not able to project exactly what's going to happen to you in the future if you take the action. So this paper, a very simple paper, is a descriptive paper, although Joe has been doing a lot of work trying to do something more sophisticated about it. We're going to look at the prevalence of risky behavior among youth and teenagers in Chile, 15 to 19, as I already told you, and we're going to measure these different behaviors: having unprotected sex, committing crime, consuming tobacco, consuming alcohol, and consuming drugs. And we're gonna correlate. So this is issue that is being edited by macroeconomists. So we have decided to put a focus on the role of economic shocks. How do economic shocks experience an economic shock correlates with the likelihood that our respondents of our survey are going to engage in some or any of these different risky behaviors. And we're going to look into shocks to employment, shocks to employment, shocks to health, and shocks to family relationships. You're going to ask about corrective solidity. We tried, we didn't get anything. I'll show you something, but at the end, we only have correlations. So what we find that there is a correlation. A job loss of the youth, him or herself, is correlated with 23 percentage points higher likelihood of binge drinking in the past year, or a health shock in the family. A serious health shock or a death of somebody in the family is also highly correlated with the likelihood of binge drinking and marijuana use. I'm going to show you the exact correlation in a bit. We also find a role for self-esteem, for social emotional skills. We've been talking a little about soft skills. Andres talked about Sina did too. Kids with higher self-esteem are less likely to engage in these behaviors. Kids with higher educational aspirations also. And we have a measure of risk aversion. This could go either way. These are correlations. They have high self-esteem because they're not binge drinking over the weekends, and all what I'm saying is simply correlations. So this paper belongs to at least 3 very related literatures. One has to do with what drives kids into these behaviors, and there's plenty of literature. The economists are working on this stuff. These are mostly economics papers. Some have to do with these soft skills, social and emotional skills that protect kids from engaging in these behaviors, educational aspirations as well. Who your friends are. Are your friends engaging in these behaviors or not? That's also correlated with the chance that you're doing that too. Youth respond to taxes, especially when it comes to tobacco and alcohol, where you can, where there is supermarkets, higher taxes reduce the chance of alcohol drinking and tobacco smoking. There are also a literature on restrictions. If you're underage and you're not allowed to buy booze, then that actually reduces the chance reduces the prevalence of alcohol drinking. There's a paper by Matías Berterón and Diana Kruger from Adolfo Ibáñez who look at the length of the school day, and as becoming longer, there's a reduced chance of teenage motherhood and crime. And also there's some literature on religious private schooling which has mixed results. There's another literature about the consequences. Lower educational attainment, lower education performance, and health and infectious diseases, fertility, labor market outcomes. I'm not going to bore you with that. And there's this literature, which we, given the macroeconomists here in the room, trying to relate to a literature on the social consequences of downturns, of economic from job losses, from what's the term? How do you spell it? How do you say? What's the he's in the school? Wachter. Okay, thank you. He's like the main person working on this. Elias Elbagli and people at the central bank have also worked on this. It's not only that when you lose your job, you have a higher chance of having persistent earning losses, but there's a higher likelihood of stress-related health problems like strokes or heart attacks, and then that reduces your life expectancy. There's a higher incidence of divorce. Kids have lower school achievement, and also there's a lower happiness and life satisfaction. So we want to add to this and to see if this also correlated with high likelihood of in risky behaviors. So data comes from a survey called Millennials in Latin America and Caribbean. With this cross-section, we gathered data in 2017. It covers 7 countries. We're only going to look at the Chilean sample today. Paper's not here, but we have information on youth aged 15 to 24, but we're only going to look at the sample today and the sample up to 19.
Why do you mention people?
Because Pepo said you want to look at older people, and older people in the sample is 24. That's like old people. So there are some old people here in the sample, in the room. The Chile sample was Centro de Microdatos. This work actually was Jaime, who's not sitting here, who worked with us gathering this data. 3,600 individuals. They are representative of the urban areas of the Región Metropolitana, Bio Bio, and Valparaíso. Our final sample is much smaller because we're reducing it to kids that age, but also because we don't have full information. We lose lots of data when we're asking them about risky behaviors, actually. There are 2 questionnaires. The goal of this survey was to look at the work and study decisions of youth in Latin America, of the Caribbean. So we asked many questions that had to do with those decisions. So we asked the typical sociodemographics, but we also have measures of the skills, cognitive and social-emotional skills. We also ask about their aspirations. We measure expectations, what are they expect to return to a college education, and so on. There are many questions and lots of details. And there's another questionnaire which was self-administered, where we asked them about these questions on risky behavior. These are the measures we have. Whether they engaged in unprotected sex in their last intercourse, whether they carried a weapon in the previous 30 days. These 2 questions, they carried a weapon or committed a robbery, were either you or one of your friends. So these are the 2 are a bit different than the other ones. So when I look at them, we separated them together. Whether they smoke tobacco. This question, what we're using here is at least every weekend in the past year. And then there's binge drinking at least once in the last year, marijuana use at least once in the last year, and consumption of other drugs also at least once in the past year.
Very good. Only 1 year?
Yes, so what is?
But that's not risky. Binge drinking once a year is not risky.
I'm going to show you all the data. Let me give you just 1 second. Here's the data. This is the one. They have not. This is the one that the highest prevalence, and as you expected, actually, MinSal has a survey on risky health behaviors, and they ask about this, and their prevalence is 60%, and perhaps it's because they say. The question is something like, I don't remember exactly, but it says something like, más de lo necesario. Drinking más de lo necesario. More than I should.
So it's not the thing that's passed out?
No,
My head was like completely.
No, they have to feel drunk, but they don't have to pass out. It's not like that.
That's what Pepo said, that's not.
We have.
¿Es lo que hace Pepo?
Pepo doesn't remember. She doesn't remember because she passed out. So then the second one is marijuana use. The marijuana use, and we have different prevalences within the past year, at least once every weekend and so on. We can play around with that. This is the one.
So you have the data.
We have some,
okay.
but there's not very much variations, and we picked up some that look like we had information, but we can do other alternatives. And so these 2 are the ones that seem to be more prevalent. This one looks. Tobacco and marijuana look very much like that other survey I just told you. Not drinking, they had much more drinking rate prevalence in the MinSal. When we talk about shocks, We also asked them about, have you experienced any of these shocks within the past year? To the youth, him or herself, whether you lost your job, whether you were seriously ill, and then there are some questions on family shocks, whether your parents divorced within the past year, or whether there was a serious illness or a death of a family member in the past year, or where you were victims of. And these are the prevalence rates of these shocks within our sample. The health is a serious illness in the household or a death in the family is the most prevalent, or 30%. On average, they report having experienced 0.7 shocks of these. These are from 0 to 5. This is how the data looks like. This is the section on demographics. You have all our sample, about 40% of those report engaging in low risk behavior, and 60% that at least report one of them. This is a p-value of the difference in means test, and you see that older kids are more likely to engage in risky behavior. Older kids within the 15-19 window, which is very short. They also have more years of education, which is correlated with being older. They're also more likely to be parents already, to have their own kids. And at the same time, having a kid at home. So I guess those are.
Income per capita, no.
No, we don't find a difference.
So Rones y Caitas, the same thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Sorones and Freitas. There are Sorones in our sample. This is the section on skills, aspirations, and what we call preferences. Numeracy skills, we asked a test where they have to divide and multiply and so. And we also, we don't find a difference there. On the social emotional skills, there's an index of locus of control, which measures your belief on if you're in control of the outcomes in your life, or everything depends on something else that's going on and you don't control what's going on. And there we see a difference. It's not engaging in risky behavior, tend to have an internal locus of control, tend to say that I'm in charge, I'm the one, things depend on me. They also have higher self-esteem, which is the Rosenberg score. We don't find a difference in the expected return to college education, but we do find a difference in educational aspirations. Those are years in addition that I want to study in life. This could be correlated because they're younger, so this could be simply because they want to end up at the same point. We have a measure of risk aversion. We ask them about lotteries. Are you willing to play this lottery? Yes or no? And then we push them until they say, okay, I'm not going to play this, or I'm going to play this one. So, and we have a dummy variable of whether they risk averse or not. And then we measure the short-term discount rate. How much do you need to be paid tomorrow or today to wait for those kinds of questions? These are huge numbers. This is an annual rate, 469%. That's the rate of short-term discount rate. These were measured for 3 months ahead, but we translated them into annual rates. And this discount difference is we ask them for now and for the future, to figure out whether there's time inconsistency. And as you see, this is the difference between the short term and the long term. So they tend to be more impatient in the short term than the long term. Oh, 5 minutes, good. So I don't have much more to say. And these are the shocks. Also, we find the statistical differences in the number of economic shocks they have faced, 0.5, 0.6 to 0.8. The chances of having lost your job, your parents having separated, and also a health issue or death in the family. We run very simple regressions. On the left-hand side, we try either the number of risky behaviors, running a Poisson regression, or each of these dummies separated. If you binge drink, whether you smoke tobacco, and we control for I just showed you. Also demographics, skills, wage expectations, aspirations. These reference parameters.
So the number of risk behavior is number of times within 1 year. No, number of times, number of different behaviors.
We add up.
So you have drugs and rape and binge drinking is 2.
These are, it could be from 0 to 7. Each one of those are what?
The maximum, no, the maximum 7.
Yeah. So again, it's not how often you do it.
No. How many of these have you engaged in within the?
7 or 6.
But you're older than this, so you're not in the stuff.
That's what I said, that there's no difference between that.
I'm gonna show you these correlations. These are simple OLS estimates. The first one is a Poisson regression because it's from 0 to 7. We're adding up these behaviors and then we're correlating each of them individually. So we find some correlation with age, as I told you before. It wasn't simple data. It's there still when we put everything together. Teenage friendhood and unprotected sex are correlated. So it seems that it makes sense. We don't find, this is the question about the Sorones. We find nothing going on in.
No, but there is of the education is possible, permittable.
Yeah, it goes different ways. We don't know why these kids do this. Then about the skills, we don't find really, there's negative coefficients almost all over for the numerical skills. That means the higher skills, the lower chance, but we only find one correlation that is significant. Nothing in locus of control, but we do find a correlation with self-esteem. That's a Rosenberg score. Nothing really to about an expected return to college education, but there's something here on educational aspirations. Having wanting to study for more years has a negative correlation with marijuana and drugs consumption. Risk aversion seems to work pretty well. And the discount rates, I'm not going to stop there because it's really messy. It goes pretty much all over the place. And here are the shocks. This is the number of shocks on the right-hand side and the number of risky behaviors on the left-hand side. It's the first coefficient there. That's a beta coefficient. It's not translated into reading into percentage ways. But we find here that it's a higher correlation with the probability of carrying a weapon, of committing robbery, you, him, herself, or the friends, smoking tobacco, binge drinking, consuming marijuana, nothing on other drugs. Then we run everything again, but now we disaggregate the number of shocks into the type of shock. And most of the action comes into job loss. You lose your job, and there's a high correlation of binge drinking, consuming marijuana, and the aggregate behavior. Also, as I told you before, the health of this in the family also shows up some correlation. This, I don't have time, but Joy has been working hard on trying to find instruments so we can say something about these economic shocks, find exogenous variation in these shocks. We tried with many things. These are the quality of the school as a potential exogenous measure, and the probability that you're going to lose your job actually doesn't work really well. Here are the results of the second stage. They're all positive, but none of them are actually significant. So not really much to say over there. So just to finish up, right on time, we know that economic shocks have effects on people's lives, health, outcomes, educational attainment, subjective well-being. In this paper, we wanted at least to move forward and say it also has a consequence of, or at least a correlation. So we can say on youth engagement in risky behavior, which may lead to worse outcomes later in life. Thank you.
We have Valeria Martinez from the Inter-American Development Bank and the Catholic University of Chile, who will make a comment on this paper. Valeria.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm going to comment on Andrea's paper. So like a very brief summary. So the question is, what are the determinants of risky behavior among children and youth? Like the second question is, after many controls, what are the effects of shocks, mainly health and job loss? They use a cross-sectional data, and that's a huge limitation of that they have to deal with in the study. It's no their fault, it's a cross-sectional. In 3 urban areas in Chile, and they find that risky behavior, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but they correlates with many different variables, among them job loss, parental separation, and health problems and death in the family. And they try to do a causality analysis. They use the number of shocks. They want to see how the number of shocks affects the risky behavior, and they use the quality of the schools as an instrument for that. And they find no significant. So I had several comments, some of context, some of the implications, and some of what could be done. So first, I would like to know, in the intro, what is this an important question? So is it something like we should be looking at in Chile? Is it Chile out of the roof or not? And I couldn't find that actually. I don't know. And then I was thinking from reading the newspapers, we always hear that in Chile we have a mental health crisis. So how that correlates with risky behavior, I will explain to that. We also know that we had a lot of school closure with COVID. So that's also something that might be useful. And also we have a lot of single parenthood. So I try to see from other sources if all of that is true. But actually it's from the OECD. We're actually very off the roof on children born out of wedlock with respect to the OECD average. We really were exaggerating because in school. So that's something that it might affect the results that you might get on risky behavior afterwards, but it also could be used at some identification. Doesn't work exactly with your data because it was afterwards, but still, I think it makes the paper more relevant. And then in mental health, it was tough to get statistics. This is something that I got from university in this meeting. But apparently we're not that off the roof. In suicide as well, I couldn't find we actually we're on average. So I think maybe trying to find an angle there, we might be this might be an interesting question because in Chile we face these conditions and therefore they're relevant, and then it also might help in the identification. So I have small questions. One, I'm not sure what data do you have on family characteristics, particularly on whether they're living with both parents or not. And given the prevalence of single parenthood, I think it might be relevant and it might be an identification strategy. And then out of curiosity, I wanted to know whether how good do you identify male parenthood? Do you, do you have more kids with by moms and by dads, or they have kids with? I'm not sure what I would do with that, but I think it will be fun to see. So then going to the identification, we have all those correlations, and then you try to identify with an instrument for those shocks. And I'm not sure it's a good instrument, so it doesn't work. So in terms of it might not work because there is no correlation. I mean, there's nothing beyond correlation. But I would like to see the F test to see whether it's a good instrument or not, or it's a weak instrument. And also, I'm not sure if it's the exclusion restriction holds because the same shock might directly affect. The quality might directly affect whether you have good or bad risky behavior, more or less risky behavior. So I was thinking, and this might work, it might not work. I think probably I should think about, and you should think about, we can think about them more. But I think the constraints are that you have a cross section, and as always in Chile, we have national policies. So it's very difficult to find variation. So here are some ideas. Might not work, probably won't work. So one is try to think about changes in education access. So the survey is 2017, right? So you might have some variation on across cohorts on whether they had access to free college or not. So that might be a source. Of course, you're going to have age effects, which are going to be difficult to deal with. But maybe, and this is maybe you can also have some variation in the geographic availability of tertiary institutions. So there are some papers that exploit that variation. So if there are more college, there is more likely people are going to go to college. It might not work because you only have 3 urban areas. And so it might be like super, and they're larger. So it might be like flat, but I don't know, I will try. And maybe not in college, but yes, in Instituto Profesionales or CFT, I have no idea. But maybe that mix could provide us you some identification. And then the other one is it's this literature that shows that the year that you finish and you get into the job market, it actually has a long-term impact on your wage path. So maybe you finish high school in a good year or a bad year, and you have like difference between cohorts that also might provide some identification. Again, it's going to be messy with the age, but it still might work. And then I was thinking, well, maybe another identification would be with teen pregnancy, parenthood, out of wedlock, like that type of literature. So there is a paper by Zarzosa, and Ursula that showed that when the contraceptive prices increased, there were more children born, and they had like worse outcomes. And there is all this literature by Clark and authors that show that access to emergency contraceptive also have an impact on maternal health and number of births. So, and I saw there are emergency contraceptives, and it's an old story, so maybe it doesn't match the period. But I saw in Clark's paper that they actually used data until 2020. Where apparently they have, if I saw it correctly, they have the number of pills that are distributed in different places. So maybe there's something there. I'm not sure how exaggerate it's going to be, but it could work. And also the price experiment collusion that Raul Ursula and Zarzosa use is also from before your survey, but I don't know. There might be something else. And then I was like trying to go back to the family health shocks. I was thinking like, if you have siblings in the data, would be rare, and there will be very few. But if you, then there might be an age difference on when the family got a bad shock, and that could be used to identify. Unlikely, but put it out there. And then I was thinking that, of course, I was thinking that the next step is to try to identify causality. And then the following step will be to try to see what is the impact of risky behavior. And then one idea there is to try to see the effect of legal marijuana in Chile. It might be just a before and after, but again, like interacting by age, my work. So finally, I would think that we're trying to think like a more like broad policy and research agenda. So I was surprised by this. So the NIMIs in Chile are low in the regional context. I thought they were going to be again like the bad example, or not. But given the school closures and the difficulties of getting kids back to school, that might be changing in a bad way. So as I was saying at the beginning, maybe the problem that you're highlighting in the paper, it's something that is going to be bigger in the future. And I would think that like the agenda should be in my mind of youth employment. We should think about alternative graduation path, and there should be research there. Like how do we get kids out of high school? Maybe with alternative pathways like the ones that they have in the US and that we don't really have like organized in Chile. Job counseling and training. I would think like Jews under the care of the state, like we have a huge responsibility there, and we know that we're not doing a good job. After school care, and also there is some literature in economy that's growing strongly about mental health and how therapies might work and how therapies combine or not with pills can work or not. So I think that all of those should have an effect on risky behavior. And by looking at the first pictures and seeing like the extent of some of the determinants of risky behavior is something that we should care about both from the policy and research point of view. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm in charge, yes. Nobody has noticed, but I'm in charge.
Francisco Vedel.
I was wondering if you could complement what you did with the input survey of the youth. I don't know if you use it, but on the downside, it has, I think, less risky behaviors and kind of have the richness of, independent variables that you have, the control and so on. But on the upside, it has much more municipalities and it's a limited section. So it might be useful if you want to try some of the ideas.
In line of what Nadia was suggesting in terms of looking at these college policy changes, right, like free college, trying to circumvent the issue of age, right? You might see if you have access to birth, date of birth,
Yeah.
you might use that as an instrument for terms of different contexts.
You only know the city, not comuna.
We do know Comuna.
This is a three larger urban areas, so I'm assuming Santiago plus other.
Experimented with the unemployment rate at the Comuna.
Yeah, that's what I was
the employment
thinking.
rate at the Comuna level, and Joey knows that doesn't work.
Okay, yeah.
Very poor influence. Yeah.
I remember a paper by Janet Curry, maybe a decade ago, where she shows that school achievement has a lot to do with how the pregnancy went. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but now, is there anything in the database where you can say something about the mother of the child? I mean, if the mother took drugs, will that make the child have a higher propensity to take drugs, for example?
So I was thinking, what Manuel just said, it's a great idea, but I don't think you have those data. But related to that, I mean, anything that happened to the parents or correct attributes of the parents are in the past, are exogenous.
Exactly.
So out of your shocks, whether a member of the family died, I think that's one of the shocks. No?
Yeah.
That's completely exogenous.
Yeah, but it's a health shock or a death in the family.
Oh, it's or not,
yeah,
they are
different.
not
That's-
separate.
Yeah, they're
Okay.
in the same person,
Okay.
so it's not that true.
Yeah. So, I mean, if some a young person has unprotected sex once, the mother is not going to die. Right, so that it would be exogenous, but you don't have that.
We don't know, we have an approximation, an proxy. We couldn't go that way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Two of your, if I understood correctly, two of your main factors that still survive are your discovery measure and your discount factor measure. At least in the
Self-esteem.
The self-esteem,
and the discount factor,
no,
I think it did.
yeah, but it goes.
And the risk
like
aversion
this,
did,
pretty much
and
the risk
the
aversion.
difference was.
Self-esteem, risk aversion, and the,
Discount factor.
one of the things.
So I would wonder, maybe these two things would probably be trying to recover Baker and Merck and all those things. What would be the cross-sectional implications of the rational addiction literature for these things? So you would have, I'm thinking of, if you have heterogeneous agents, ones that are more, in which rational, the habit formation factor is higher than the other one, would probably translate into some of these things, like a discount factor, difference in discount factors and difference in risk aversion. So maybe that would be a cross-sectional implication of your Torah literature.
Thanks. Well, thank you. Thank all of you for your attention and the comments. Thank you, Claudia, for the thoughtful comments and the ideas. You have to share those slides with us. We haven't been at the paper yet. They're angry with us, so I can write the context, can do all that. All this are your suggestions. Actually, we asked about mental health. We know whether we have the DHQ-9, which measures symptoms of depression, so we can actually add into that. That's a paper we have on hold, though. They're really interesting and inviting. Actually, we're thinking about matching this data with administrative data and move on looking at the stuff that happened afterwards. So we're asking for. We don't have the people to do that yet, so that hopefully will happen next. Solution test, well, many ideas on JMA that we can look into. We don't know about the siblings. I'm going to say something else, but I don't remember, so I'll let you know later on.
You know I'm thinking about Emily Oster suddenly because she has this risky behavior about AIDS and trucking in Africa.
Yeah.
Do you have any information on the occupation of the parents?
No, we know, that's what we're saying. We know if they live with them now, and if they don't live with them right now, when we ask them why. Until which age did you live with them? So we know. We know, no, but if you lived with your parents, your biological parents until age 10, that's something that happened in the past. There could be something interesting in there that we're actually looking into, but we don't know what the occupation is.
Risky behavior
Yeah.
is about in Africa.
What else, Francisco? Yeah, you're right. We could do this. It's a complementary analysis that we could do. Thank you, Cristina, for the idea. We don't have an exact age, but we do have some variation there. And if we move into age 24, we can do more than what we're doing right now. So, Manuel, I'm going to look for that paper. So, shocked. I have to think. That's my word. Thank you.
Yes, that's one thing before our last presentation. I want to thank Marcus Kirchner, who's presenting this paper on social security because he's just arriving from Australia. And I have to make a second clarification. The first time that I met him, I asked him, "You are Kirchner?" Yeah, from Germany. That's a clarification, get to have it out.
Yeah.
So now, the
Okay.
moderator.
Anyhow, now to close, we have a paper by Elias Albagli, Agustin Arias, and Marcus Kirchner, all of them from the Central Bank of Chile. The title is Collective Saving, Pension Policy in an Economy with Heterogeneity, and informality. Then we'll have a discussion by Alejandra Combs. Right ahead.
Hey, thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to present this paper. Actually thought I was presenting at 4:30. I had some time, but apparently you went really fast. Okay,
Presenting earlier too.
Luckily she made it.
right,
Luckily she made it.
yeah, I should say, we all work at the Central Bank of Chile, but this means that the views that we express in this paper are ours, right? And not necessarily represent the position of the bank. Okay, what's the sort of context of this paper? Around the world, demographic changes and social demands are putting increasing pressure on existing pension regimes. Right? So these challenges are shared by advanced or developed economies and developing emerging markets. Right? It's the same, but In the case of developing economies and emerging markets, those often also face those challenges, different economic structures. So among other things, these economies tend to have larger degrees of labor inequality, income inequality also, and they also have development objectives, right, that are perhaps more ambitious than those of already developed economies related to growth and capital market development, for example. So the key public policy questions that we might ask in this context is how to design pension schemes, also pension reforms, and what are their macroeconomic effects on labor markets and also on capital accumulation. So in this context, one interesting idea that has been around for some time are those collective defined contribution pension schemes, right, which have been proposed as a third way between individual defined contribution and defined benefit systems. So these collective defined contribution schemes essentially have intra-generational savings, but with some redistributive component, right? So there's some solidarity component within those schemes, which are, for example, are not present in these individual defined contribution schemes, but which tend also to be present in defined benefits, which are also known as pay-as-you-go. Okay, so that's the context. So what do we do in this paper? We analyze macro effects of pension schemes, including collective savings, in a structural general equilibrium model with dual labor markets and income heterogeneity. Right? So that's related to different parts of the literature on social security reforms. That literature, on the one hand, tends to concentrate on particular aspects, right, like job mobility, retirement timing, also capital market effects. And then, on the other hand, studies of macro effects of pension reforms are all mostly empirical or mostly partial equilibrium studies. So there's actually also a few studies for Chile. One of them, I think, is Schubert here, which is a partial equilibrium study. So that's one part of the literature. On the other hand, there's some recent general equilibrium analysis. Frassi et al. Is a recent paper. In that paper, they also analyze collective defined contribution schemes. Right? These have been analyzed in the literature from other perspectives also, including risk sharing or stability of participation when participation is voluntary. But there's few studies of macro effects. Frassi is one of them, but they don't have different genres type, but they don't have as a dual labor market. Right? They do have income heterogeneity, but no dual labor market. So that means they cannot really look at effects on formal labor, informal labor, and possible substitution between the two. Right? So here's was one contribution for analysis to that literature. So what's the advantage in general of a structural general equilibrium analysis? That type of exercise permits to do consistent exercises, right? That permit to evaluate the interaction of different margins in general equilibrium and also second round effects of different policies. And perhaps equally important, they allow to do these consistent exercises ex ante, right? So here we're analyzing policy reforms, but sometimes policies that have never been implemented, and so as to be able to do some empirical study on the macroeconomic effects. Also, that's the contribution, let's say, to the literature in general. And then the other thing we do is to focus on the case of Chile. Right? There's another contribution. So there's no general equilibrium study for Chile of pension reforms. But in Chile, as many of you know, we have an ongoing discussion on pension reform for a long time already. And among other characteristics, the Chilean economy has a large informal sector, right? It also has income heterogeneity, right? With an important degree of informality, of income inequality. So the informal sector is about 1/3 of total employment in Chile. So it seems important to take this dimension into account. So what do we do? In this paper, we build an overlapping generations model, which, among other features, has an heterogeneous worker skills and the informal sector. And then we calibrate that model to the Chilean economy. And we use it to examine the long-term macroeconomic effects of increasing pension contributions according to 4 alternative pension schemes. So we analyze, compare 4 schemes: a fully funded individual defined contribution plan, a pay-as-you-go system, which is unfunded, and then we analyze 2 collective defined contribution schemes, one where benefits of pensions are conditional contributions, and another one where these benefits are unconditional on contributions. So the individually funded here, the defined contribution is similar to the existing pension system in Chile, right? It's a fully funded pension system with a defined contribution that goes into individual plans. Okay, so these different schemes also allow to capture intra and intergenerational distributional aspects, right? So in these, we have intragenerational redistribution, and in the pay-as-you-go system, we have intergenerational.
Explain, I'm sorry, could you explain a little more about the last two lines to the options 3 and 4? I don't understand how does collective defined contribution,
Okay.
whether it's conditional or unconditional, I mean.
Yeah, okay. So here in this case, we come, so what we are going to analyze is a contribution by the firm, right? So the firm pays a payroll tax, and then that tax goes into a pension fund. That pension fund is accumulated on behalf of each generation, right? And then at the end, or when that generation comes into pension age, then the funds are redistributed within that generation. So that could be unconditionally. So basically, you receive pension contributions without any conditionality on your labor, on your contributions when you were working, right? Or they could be conditional so that you, for example, receive some points, right, according to your contributions, and then your benefits depend on these.
So how different is it from what people in Chile for when that's also analysis?
Not different.
That's also number 3. That's number 3. That's what
Number 3 is close
Number
to
3 is
what the
quite
government
different.
proposed.
But it has some of that spirit, right? So here people receive a market return. So those are invested in the capital market, and the generation receives what the market generated in terms of return of that investment in capital. Notional accounts, not necessarily as a market.
Market minus 1%. Minus 100 basis points.
Yeah, it could be that. Yeah, it could be that, but then I think about what was recently proposed in by the
savings.
Here you also have an intergenerational redistributive component initially, right? So here there's no intergenerational redistribution. Pensions are used only within each generation.
Yes.
And not used to finance current pensions. Anyhow, I think I've run a slide on those different schemes. So let me briefly mention the main findings of this analysis. So we find that the individual defined contribution and the collective scheme that is conditional have similar macro effects, including a moderate positive effect on the formal labor market, aggregate savings and output. Informality decreases under both these two schemes, but it decreases more strongly under the collective defined contributions. So I'm going to explain why that happens. The success of this conditional defined contribution scheme hinges quite critically upon conditioning benefits on contributions in order to incentivize the formal labor status of lower income households. The unconditional scheme has inferior effects in that sense because there's no conditionality. And the pay-as-you-go system has, among other schemes, the most adverse effects on savings, capital, labor market, and output, because in that scheme you deaccumulate capital. Right? And we do some exercise on population aging, so we do a population transition. Here we find that the solvency of that conditional defined contribution scheme, like the individual defined contribution scheme, is robust to population aging, which is another important shortcoming of the pay-as-you-go system. Okay, so let me show a couple of slides on model. So we have an overlapping generations model, which has perfect foresight, with some deviation from that, which I'm going to explain in a second. That model has 3 generations, so there's young, middle-aged, and old, and it's quite standard for Samuelson Diamond. We start from that very standard framework, right? Then we do a couple of extensions, so capture the most relevant margins. So first we introduce heterogeneous productivities, right? Allow us to capture an asymmetric income distribution, right? We have heterogeneous discount factors, which are decreasing in the income level that allows to match observed savings rates for different income groups. Then we introduce an informal sector together with the formal sector, which allows to capture variations in labor supply along the extensive margin between the formal and the informal sector. If people perceive pensions as a tax, right, there might be an incentive to move into informality. And we introduce some type of friction, which is introduced as a sort of shortcut. So we put an incomplete internalization of pension benefits, which might capture something like financial or informational frictions, but the consequence of that is that people imperfectly substitute mandatory savings with lower voluntary savings. So in our model, people imperfectly understand how the pension system works, right? Or they cannot substitute higher mandatory contributions with lower voluntary savings, right? And that's in line with the literature, both for the international level, Atanasio has Descriptive Papers on that, and also for Chile, there's some evidence in Morandé that once you introduce a mandatory pension, that actually total saving increases, right? And mandatory savings don't decline in the same way as voluntary savings don't decline in the same way as mandatory savings increase, right? So these that's an important friction in our model. Essentially, what that does is that mandatory savings have a very standard model. If you have individual defined contribution, you introduce a pension, only mandatory savings increase, voluntary savings decrease, and there's no effect on the rest of the allocation, right? So that's very strange. And that's why should we have mandatory savings, right, at all? So that's in conflict and introduced to have some both. Another interesting thing that is incomplete internalization generates is that people perceive pensions as a tax, right? At least partially, which means that in our model also there's incentives to move into informality if that happens, right? So we capture that margin, but also in the discussion on pensions, also in Chile is a bit of an aspect that has generated some preoccupation. And then we do some minor extensions of financially open economy and some other minor things. Okay, so how do firms work? Firms, these are formal sector firms, but we have a production function with capital labor and some labor augmenting here. And they have an heterogeneous labor input. So we assume here 5 skill groups, which in the model then are equivalent to the income quintiles, right? These skill groups have different skills AI. And these different skills apply to both young and middle-aged labor, right? So we have 2 working age populations, young and middle-aged, and then there's also an old generation. We also have here imperfect substitution between skills, right? Which gives some complementarity, which is controlled by this parameter, which there are some interesting aspects, but I would say it's not too quick. And firms maximize profits, and they pay a payroll tax, right, tau F here, which is used to finance pension contributions. So you see when you take in the first order conditions, an increase in those pension contributions will decrease the gross wage. For example, if that increases by 5%, then the gross wage it decreased by 1 over 1 plus 5%. So it decreased by 4.8%, right? You see in our model actually wages decrease are quite different than 5% because there's important general equilibrium effects, right? So that would be a partial equilibrium. Then there's workers of type I, right? For each skill group, these workers, so within each skill group, these workers are identical and they maximize present lifetime utility, right? That's discounted utility here. They have different discount factors, beta I. So there's the young, the middle-aged, and the old, right? The young and the middle-aged, they work. And they can work in the formal sector and the informal sector. So L is formal sector work and H is informal sector work. And there's an additional disutility on working in the informal sector. So there's some bigger cost of being informal, right? Precarious work, for example. And then we have here some preference shifter, which we introduced to regulate the wealth effect on labor. So we're going to assume in the whole paper 0 wealth effect on labor supply. So it means that labor is an upward sloping function in the net wage. Then the sort of new aspect in our model, existing ones, is that we have a labor shifting between the formal and the informal sector. And the informal sector is modeled as home production, right? So here people can generate additional income by working in the informal sector, right? There's a discount on productivity, so these productivities BAs are smaller than the productivity in the formal sector. And then there's some type of congestion also in the informal sector. So if there's a lot of people working in that informal sector, then productivity decreases even more, right? Means you have sort of also decreasing returns to work in the informal sector. So that's for us a couple of papers. And the budget constraints are
G is sort of 20 years, is it?
T is 20 years.
20 years, okay.
Each generation is
Yeah, so you have 3 generations.
20 years to nothing, and then 40 years in your pension taxes. Okay, so consumption per period here, you see the budget constraints. So the young, or they work, right? They receive formal labor or informal labor. That introduces some non-linearity in our model, right? The age, so you can all work in the formal sector or the informal sector, some fraction, or dedicate all of your available time to the formal and informal sector. They pay individual pension contribution rate, which is tau W, it's the workers' pension. So in the model, we model that as an individual defined contribution plan. And then there's some income tax which we use for calibration of other things. So then these young, they can save, right? That means that their savings, they move from period forward if it has a return R. And then again, they can work and save another fraction of their income. It moves to the period when they are old. And then they receive also the pension, right? So they receive self-finance pension here and government finance pensions. Okay, and then we can write down the intertemporal budget constraints. So that's what people take into account when maximizing utility or consumption. That's when we introduce this informal, this incomplete internalization of future pension benefits. So in a standard model, you would have here a 1 multiplying pension. So people completely take into account the pension that they will receive. We introduce a simple feature here that the phi can be between 0 and 1, right? So that means that people don't internalize their whole pension. That's a shortcut. So it could, for example, represent financial frictions, right? Or informational frictions. It could also represent preferences. So if you have hyperbolic preferences, probably you get something like this. Myopia, exactly. So it could stand for different things, right? Okay, so that's the workers' problem. Then we have the pension system. So here, a bit more details. So pensions have 2 components. There's the worker finance component, which has a 10% contribution rate, normally calibrated for Chile, formal labor income. These funds are deposited in individual accounts and invested in domestic and foreign capital at a return on. And then firms can pay a contribution, which will be in the initial steady state is 0, and we move that to 5% in our exercise, right? So now firms pay a payroll tax, and there's 4 alternative uses. First use would be in the individual defined contribution. So it's the same scheme as the first one here, only that firms finance that scheme. And there's the collective conditional defined contribution. The funds are invested on behalf of each generation, and the returns are distributed according to labor effort. But we assume that it's not distributed according to the wage. So it means that for each contribution, right, if you work, you obtain 1 point. That point doesn't depend on your wage, right? So since workers have different wages, every income group receives a similar number of points, right, for working. And then the funds are distributed within that generation. So automatically here we have intra-generational redistribution, right? Because the people that have lower skills in our models, they have a lower wage, but they receive the same points for their contribution as the higher income groups. And we have these unconditional schemes. There's no conditioning of benefits on labor effort. All the benefits are distributed, and we assume that the highest skill groups here receive nothing of that redistribution. So there is redistribution within that generation, right? But just within income groups. So I think the two highest groups receive nothing of that pension. It all goes to the lowest income groups. And we also assume that those benefits are decreasing in the self-finance component of pensions, right? So if you receive a pension from that firm finance or state pension system, obligatory pension system, then you receive less if you have a higher pension finance. Sort of the spirit of the existing solidary pillar and chip. And then the last scheme is a pay-as-you-go. So the contributions are used the same period they are collected to pay for pensions. So the workers pay contributions and those go into pensions of the order within the same generations, right? And we also have some distribution rule in that case. Here we assume a constant replacement ratio among skill groups. So every skill group receives some fraction of their age when they were middle-aged, right? Which means that the higher income groups receive a higher pension than the lower income groups, right? So that's one type of pay-as-you-go scheme. You could make that completely redistributive so that everyone receives the same, right? But actually, that feature in our model is sort of good for the pay-as-you-go system. So it maintains some of the incentives for the higher income groups to keep on working. It would make that completely redistributive. That would be even more adverse effects. That's good. Okay, so then aggregate voluntary and mandatory savings are these S and SP, right? So here you accumulate all of the funds that goes into some pension fund, which is neither public, it's a public pension fund in our model, but the model is not really so explicit if that is a government or a privately managed system, right? It's unimportant actually for the results. And then all of the pensions, so the self-finance, the voluntary savings here, right, S, and the obligatory savings, both from the worker finance component and the firm finance component, which only applies on these first three schemes, right? Because the pay-as-you-go doesn't accumulate any capital. That goes into capital. Fraction 1 minus gamma of that goes into domestic capital, and a fraction gamma goes abroad at a international interest rate. So we introduce that to have some open economy aspect, right? If that would be zero, then the effects would be even stronger, right? Because all of the pension capital goes into domestic investments, right? So actually that sort of reduces a bit the effects. And then we also assume that the foreigners own some fraction of the domestic capital stock, which is exogenous. That also affects a bit the steady state, but not too much. Okay, so that's the model. Now, I have 3 or 4 slides on the results. So first, the group of results here is comparing the different schemes. So what we do here is to do comparative statics. So we assume an increase of the pension contribution rate of firms from 0 to 5%, right? Starting in the initial steady state. Then we solve for the final steady state, which is a nonlinear model. So we have to do some numerical methods here to get the results. But then we get the final steady state and we can compute the percentage difference between the initial and the final. So these are long run effects, right? It takes 50, 60 years to reach those effects. It's not immediate, right? Because our model has only 3 periods. Okay, so what do we have here in terms of those results? So you see, here's the individual defined contribution, the other schemes. That scheme has a positive effect on total savings, capital consumption, and formal sector GDP. The conditional defined contribution and the unconditional collective defined contribution, they also have positive effects on capital, right, and GDP, but there's some differences here on the GDP. So first on these savings, you see how mandatory savings increase a bit more than 4%. That's a fraction of GDP, right? And voluntary savings decrease. So there's some substitution of mandatory savings with voluntary savings, but that substitution is not complete, right? The very standard model without any frictions. And if you introduce individual defined contribution, there will be no effects here. And only there will be substitution between the voluntary and mandatory savings. Okay, and then the other thing that happens is that under individual defined contribution and this conditional collective scheme, you have actually quite similar effects, right? For all of those variables. But the effects are smaller under the unconditional scheme. And we will see that's mainly through the labor market. Right? So the GDP effect is not less negative, although you increase capital. Right? Also, the effect on capital is like less negative, so the general equilibrium effects are too short. And then the pay-as-you-go scheme produces negative effects on all variables, so it decreases savings, right? Decreases capital consumption and GDP. That's because you eat up your capital, right? So you deaccumulate capital, and really the working generation, they perceive that scheme as a tax. 5 minutes? Sorry. 3 slides, I think, 3 or 4 slides. So now I wanted to explain a bit the mechanism. Perhaps this simple example is useful, right? So imagine now you have an economy with 2 periods, right? And agents receive an endowment of 100 units in the first period, right? And their consumption plan is such that they want to consume the same amount of units within each period, right? In 1 period. Okay, so if there's no monetary savings, no frictions, they receive this endowment, consume 50 and 50 in each period. So that means since they're owed in the second period, they have to save 50 and total savings are 50. So now, if you introduce mandatory savings, you have no frictions, right? So, and people completely understand that pension system. So let's say that you introduce mandatory savings of 20, right? And agents understand that in the future, they're going to receive 20 as a pension from the state, so they only need to save 30, right? But they still want to consume 50 and 50, right? So total savings here don't change. But then you introduce, if you have frictions, so people only internalize partially that pension system. So let's say you have 50% of pensions internalized. So agents think they only receive a pension of 10, although they pay a tax of 20, right? That means they think they're poorer, so they have 90 of lifetime income now. So they want to consume 45 in each period, right? And they only save 35, right? So 35 plus 10 then is their pension, would be their consumption of 45 in each period. And then they come into the next period, and actually pensions are 20, which means that they will consume more than they were young, and total savings increase, right? So you have mandatory savings of 20 and voluntary savings of 35, right? So that means these frictions or incomplete internalization of pension benefits generates expansionary effects on savings and capital. So that's the key mechanism of the. So now on the effects on the labor market, here I'm showing the effects on wages, informal work and formal work, and also formal work for the different skill groups. So you see how wages fall under all of the schemes, but the response is quite different for the different schemes due to general equilibrium effects. Informal work decreases under the individual defined contribution and the conditional collective defined contribution, but it increases under the unconditional collective defined contribution. It also increases quite strongly under the pay-as-you-go system. Right? Informal work increases for the individual scheme and the collective conditional scheme, but it falls for the unconditional scheme. It falls very strongly for the pay-as-you-go system. So why does that happen? Right, you see the different scale groups and the individual defined contribution actually increase quite similarly their work. So that's because capital increases and that increases labor demand. Right, so there's bigger demand for labor because it's complementary with capital, and that generates positive effects on formal work. Now, under the conditional collective scheme, formal work increases much more strongly for the lower income groups, and actually falls for the highest income groups, right? So these groups here are benefited by the redistribution in the intergenerational scheme. These ones are not, but still there's higher labor demand. So that means that even in this group, you can still have positive labor. Actually, they also receive something of that conditional scheme, right? So, but it's partially attached. But the aggregate effect on labor is still positive here. And also the GP effect for that reason. So now under that unconditional scheme, you see how labor falls for all of them, right? So all of these agents now think they're paying taxes, right? So they reduce their labor supply, right? Some of them even reduce it more because there's incentive for them to pay a lower self-finance pension, right? Because the state finance pension is increasing when they reduce their self-finance pension. So that's why even for those schemes, the formal labor falls even more, right? And the pay-as-you-go system has very negative effects for all of these income groups because there they pay a tax, right? It's unconditional what they receive, and labor demand also falls, right? Due to a falling cut. So that explains this negative GDP effect for the pay-as-you-go system. Yeah, then the final exercise that we did is to do some demographic transition, right? To see how robust these different schemes are between to population aging. So we assume a fall in the population growth rate from 0.5% per year to 0.025% per year, right? So that's an exogenous shock, which then we can simulate a transition over the periods. So here we see how the fall in population growth increases the ratio of active to passive agents. That's this red line here. That ratio of active to passive agents, passive to active agents, sorry, increases by a couple of percentage points. Then, since there's less labor, capital becomes relatively abundant, which generates a decrease in the interest rate, right? It shows an increase in wages and a movement to the formal sector. That's why the individually financed pension increases a bit, right? But the firm finance pension also increases a bit under the savings-based schemes, so the individual, the collect, and both collective schemes. But under the pay-as-you-go system, that pension, right? So we assume here in the performance of 85%, and then population growth falls. And that here is that is a pay-as-you-go system in that case generates a fall in those pensions. So that's sort of this standard result that pay-as-you-go systems are not robust to population aging, right? Which is good to see that it also happens in the other schemes. They're not too different actually. The conditional scheme is a bit better, which has a bit more positive effects on that transition than the unconditional scheme. Okay. Okay, so perhaps the key takeaway here is that we find that a collective savings scheme can have similar effects as an individual-based savings scheme, right? While achieving some redistribution, right? And that scheme is also robust to population aging. And but the positive outcomes of that scheme, they hinge critically upon conditioning benefits on labor effort. And in contrast, the pay-as-you-go system is quite inferior in terms of macroeconomic effects than those savings-based schemes, especially under population aging. So overall, perhaps our results might suggest that collective savings pension policies can be a sustainable alternative for countries with significant labor informality and income heterogeneity, but they have to be designed properly. Okay, thank you.
Oye, Marcos, espero que entiendas castellano, porque preparé mis comentarios en castellano. Bien. Bueno, primero agradezco a la FEN, a los organizadores y por supuesto a Pepo por darme la oportunidad de participar en esta conferencia y comentar este excelente trabajo. Tiene 3 autores, Elías Abagli, Agustín Arias y Marcos Kirchner, los 3 economistas del Banco Central. Este paper está escrito el 2020. Es importante al final, pero el resto no importa. Desarrollan un modelo teórico de generaciones traslapadas. Las personas viven 3 periodos, trabajan los 2 primeros periodos y descansan el tercero. Y usan simulaciones con este modelo para contestar preguntas respecto al efecto del diseño de un sistema de pensiones en una economía de mercado donde hay algunas características especiales. Primero, los trabajadores difieren en capacidades y por tanto en su salario y hay, por lo tanto, una distribución de salario. Segundo, hay dualidad en el mercado laboral, por lo que solo los trabajadores formales cotizan. Tercero, existe un sistema de capitalización individual con cotizaciones de los trabajadores. Y esa parte del sistema no se analiza mucho en el paper, excepto al principio, en que se dice, bueno, este es un sistema donde las contribuciones son iguales a los beneficios en valor presente, por lo tanto no afectan el salario, no afectan nada en la economía, excepto si hay fricción. ¿Ya? Y cuarto, se introduce un programa adicional con cotizaciones de las empresas, las cuales pueden ir a 4 distintos fondos o a 4 distintos destinos. Cuenta individual, como la inicial, cuenta colectiva con beneficios proporcionales a puntos o, digamos, a horas trabajadas, pero no al ingreso. Entonces es distinto de la cuenta de capitalización individual. Y tiene distribución intrageneracional porque, por diseño, todos los beneficios de una generación, todas las contribuciones de una generación se pagan en beneficios a la misma generación. Y en el tercera alternativa es que sea también una cuenta colectiva, pero los beneficios de todas las contribuciones van a solo un porcentaje de la población, los más pobres, y digamos, no solamente hay esa distribución que es más estricta, es más grande, sino que además los beneficios son inversamente proporcionales a las pensiones de la primera parte. O sea, como es, de cierta forma, los beneficios que eran hasta el 2022 con la PDU, la pensión básica solidaria y el APS. ¿Ya? Sería un poquito distinto si hicieran este trabajo con la PGU. Pero no importa, así es. Y después la cuarta opción es que sea un sistema de reparto puro, donde todas las contribuciones de los periodos 1 y 2 van a pagar los beneficios de los pensionados. Simple sistema de reparto. En el modelo, los trabajadores pagan impuesto al ingreso, un T que aparece en el modelo, además de cotizaciones, TW en el modelo. Las empresas no pagan impuestos. Y esto es un punto muy importante que como que queda un poquito escondido en el paper, porque es el que las empresas paguen impuestos, lo que acarrea todos los efectos. Pero bueno, al introducir una cotización a pagar por las empresas, se reduce el salario neto que las empresas tienen que pagar un impuesto. Y al mismo tiempo aumenta el valor presente de las pensiones porque van a haber beneficios. O sea, este es el nuevo programa. Dependiendo del sistema, si es tipo capitalización individual, capitalización colectiva, condicional que llaman, o capitalización colectiva no condicional, o sistema de reparto, se produce un aumento del valor presente de beneficios del trabajo, pero es más alto para algunos que para otros, obviamente dependiendo cuál es el esquema que se usa. Se reduce el impuesto al ingreso de todos los trabajadores, por lo tanto aumenta el empleo formal. ¿Me siguen? Porque todos los trabajadores formales van a tener que pagar menos impuestos al trabajo, pero sus salarios disminuyen. ¿No? Porque aumenta el empleo formal, aumenta el ahorro, aumenta la producción. Pero síganme que el impacto viene todo porque las empresas no pagan impuestos. ¿Siguen? Ok. Tercero, los efectos 1 y 2, esto que se produce un aumento del valor presente de los beneficios del trabajo y se reduce el impuesto al ingreso de todos los trabajadores. Estos efectos 1 y 2 se examinan en el paper sin considerar envejecimiento. O sea, aquí el gran impacto de este sistema, lo primero que analizan es todo un efecto impositivo. ¿Quién paga los impuestos y quién recibe el valor presente de los beneficios de pensión en estas alternativas? Agregan una sección 5 que incluye envejecimiento. ¿Y cómo lo hacen? Como lo hacen todos los modelos de generaciones traslapadas. Reducen la tasa de crecimiento de la población. O sea, de repente hay un poquito menos jóvenes que al principio en el primer modelo hay la misma cantidad de personas en las 3 etapas, ¿ya? Y de repente empiezan a disminuir los jóvenes. Ese es el envejecimiento en estos modelos. Y claramente la relación entre personas activas y personas pasivas baja. Se disminuye el crecimiento de la población. En los 3 sistemas con ahorro, las pensiones aumentan. ¿Por qué? Porque disminuye el trabajo, sigue el mismo capital, aumenta el salario, se ahorra más y aumentan las pensiones. En el sistema de reparto las pensiones necesariamente bajan. ¿Ya? Este resultado es muy claro y es muy importante. Y es súper importante que los autores le pongan ahí como un gran lo subrayen. Porque mucha gente no entiende por qué los sistemas de reparto no son buenos para las pensiones, especialmente cuando hay envejecimiento, que esto es lo que tenemos en la vida, tenemos envejecimiento. Entonces, no al sistema de reparto. Esa es una conclusión muy importante del paper. ¿Qué propongo para hacer que este trabajo, que es excelente, lleno de detalles, pero súper contundente, sea aún mejor? Primero, yo eliminaría el tema de las fricciones porque no ayudan. Lo que importa son los impuestos. Yo creo que las fricciones pueden ser un apéndice, pero nada más. Segundo, yo incluiría el impuesto al ingreso de las empresas y haría el análisis sin y con. Con esto, con el impuesto a las empresas, se puede simular el sistema que tenemos en Chile, que es capitalización individual más pilar solidario financiado con impuestos generales. Porque no es un impuesto al trabajo el que financia el pilar solidario aquí, es un impuesto general. Incluir la característica del impuesto al ingreso que tenemos, que solo lo paga un porcentaje de los trabajadores. Por lo tanto, es aún más distributivo que lo que supone este modelo. Y incluir un quinto esquema de pensiones que combine cuentas individuales financiadas con cotización del trabajador con una pensión garantizada que es financiada con impuestos al ingreso de las empresas y de los trabajadores de alto ingreso. Y ahí compararía los 5. Ese es mi comentario. Muchas gracias.
Perhaps there's some questions that Mark can take. Castellano, inglés, whatever.
Alemán.
Marcus.
No, but yeah.
Marcus, I have a question. It's actually a question. It's not a comment. I didn't understand the role of the congestion in the informal labor market. Why do you need that? Or what happens if you shut it down? What does it do within the market? The congestion in the informal labor market?
Congestion. Congestion in the labor market.
Andres has a question, I believe, in the comment.
Very interesting. Very, very informative. However, this equivalence between the individual savings pension account and a contributory system. Yeah, remember how you call it, the conditional condition. They seem equivalent in model. So more than a question, I have a comment that increasingly what you've seen in Chile and Peru, Chile,
for you, is that when you have individual savings, it's very tempting for people to withdraw the money. Since perceive it's their money. So there's a political economy problem, which implies that the private pension system will be into accounts more risky economy point of view, which may in the long run have micro effects. In fact, in Chile, did have some down pension savings. So they're not that equivalent to take that into account.
Any other comments?
Please.
Yes, I have a follow-up regarding the points in the collective savings scheme, and because I think that the saving rate of the economy will be reduced. The effort is not perfectly observable. So you don't have the same incentive to exert effort when your pension is private than when it's generational. So what do you think would happen if you add like friction in there, like observing those points?
Why don't you, perdón, sí, Rómulo.
One of the good things about having 50 years of studies economy is that there are probably a few papers that have touched at least in some part to what you did. So there are a few papers. One of them that I remember that discusses the effects that the Pilar Solidario had on labor market participation and informal sector. So and basically what you can say from that paper is that they do basically what your model says. What you're gonna see is the competitive effect that can be discussed, because the Pilar Solidario has flavor of one of your exercises. That maybe has to be taken into account is that basically one of the motivations for the Pilar Solidario was supposed to be that there were these lagoons, estas lagunas previsionales, the people that were not contributing as regularly as they should. So wisely, don't recalling that leisure is a normal good, and that the informal sector is an outlet when you have this parachute at the end of the day. The Pilar Solidario converted these lagoons in oceans. So now what you have instead of lagoons are oceans, because that is what basically this paper and any paper that will consider this kind of incentive would say that would happen. And that is basically what is going to happen.
Okay, thank you for the comments and first, Alexandra, your points. Would be very different if you did this so probably it would change some things in the initial steady state, but I don't think it would change a lot the comparison between steady states, right? So if you introduce
PGU is basically a lump sum. So there is no distortion that you can think that will change the result in one or another way, because it's just a lump sum.
But that's
the Pilar Solidario.
It has an income.
So the original pillar, right, the 2018 one is a triangle, right? So your solidary pension, it decreases linearly with your own finance pension. What the PQ did is to convert that into a rectangle, right?
Correct.
And then it puts a triangle on the side. So now it's more generous, right?
Yeah.
It's unconditional initially, but at some point, still your pension decreases with your own finance. I think that around 1 million pesos pension in Europe, you don't get it, right? So that would apply to the self-finance pension, right? And if we introduce such a type of scheme for some of the distribution benefits for the firm finance pension, it probably would change things. But I don't think it would change a lot the steady state comparison. Of course, we haven't done it, and we would need to check. But a priori, I think it doesn't change too much. So, and now if the firms don't pay taxes, so here the firms are like the households, right? In the end, what they do is to maximize profits and to to pay off the profits to households or as investment receipts or as wages. So the firms here, they're just intermediaries, if you want. Right? I see your point that probably there's some rents from other agents that are owners of the firms, but those are not in our models. It's just too simple to capture these margins. Right? And then you suggested to eliminate the frictions and to emphasize the taxes. So maybe that wasn't clear. So if you don't have frictions, then there's no taxes, right? Because people, at least in the individual accounts and the conditional schemes, people don't perceive it as a tax. So you need the frictions so that people perceive the pension and partially as a tax, for which we have a lot of empirical evidence that actually is what happens. So that's why we emphasize so much.
But let me clarify one thing. All the effects of your increase in pensions financed by the firms, all the effects are driven by the fact that firms don't pay income tax. And therefore now the tax increases for the firms. And therefore, net wages for workers go down. I think that there is an issue here with your model that has income tax on people, but not on firms. But anyway, that's my point. Yeah.
And then the other comments of what there's maybe congestion. I think that's because if you don't have that, then the transitions are too big, right, between the sectors. Was all that, all the transitions are too small, but something weird happened. So that's why we calibrated. Actually, we introduced that income tax, TAO, without any WNF, so that a 5% increase in an income tax generates some movement into informality, which we calibrate with this other study by Schuler 2015, which was for Chile, a partially clean study. So we try to match this more reasonable margin of moving into informality. And then the political economy problems, I think maybe here I differ a bit. I think there's also political economy problems if the state has access to the pension system, right? And you've seen that in Argentina and other countries that on the state terms, and it takes that because they always need more money to finance the government spending, right? But yeah, problems that just there. So the unobservable effort, I think that's a very good point. I mean, but in a sense that issue is easier in our rule because we just say if you contribute something, you get a point, right? So you just have to contribute. Right? But maybe that means that then people would try to contribute as less as possible, but that's not compatible with the margin in our muscles. They still have higher productivity in the formal sector, right? So also if you just reduce a lot your work in the formal sector, I mean your income just diminishes, right? Because you go in the informal sector, you see for and also it's related to these lagoons, and probably there's exogenous lagoons, right, which are not announced. So we have no uncertainty, climate uncertainty, right, in our model. So
lower sales.
Yeah, low sales, but perhaps the lagoons that are more due to if you have the margin between almost the same return or income in the formal and the informal sector, then you have a lagoon in some sense in that model because you're informal. Yeah, I hope we cited some paper from Students Economy. Okay, so
Well, thank you very much.
Terminó justo a la hora.
Start with Luigi sharp at 8:30. 8:30. So, yeah, so he's thinking.
¿Cuántos años?
Sí,
¿Cómo estás?
más o menos, ahí estamos. Me caí así como una semana atrás y todavía estoy internado ahora. La pequeña
¿Te quebraste o te trizaste?
me fracturé una vez.